Unlike previous economic booms, the 1950s and 60s boom distributed wealth broadly. Disposable income grew 33% in the 50s and then another 50% in the 60s. Nevertheless, 20 to 30% of people, disproportionately black, still lived in poverty. The post-war period represented the high mark of faith in liberal government. In the 1960s, polls showed that most Americans trusted their government to do the right thing. The government, after all, had defeated the Nazis, rebuilt Europe and Japan, constructed the national highways, and fostered the post-war boom. So many Americans believed that environmental degradation, poverty, and inequality could be solved once and for all. What they wanted was not just a wealthy society, but a great society. In this video, I explore how the war on poverty attempted to address racial inequality. The war on poverty ultimately failed to eradicate racial inequality because Great Society liberals blamed a culture of poverty among the poor for destitution rather than the structural inequities of the economy. Consequently, they worked through the very channels of power which perpetuated racial inequality. Furthermore, pandering politicians and middle-income whites mobilized to preserve racial hierarchy by embracing privatization, by protecting geographical segregation, and by criminalizing poverty. The assassination of John Kennedy in 1963 united liberal voters behind the Lyndon Johnson administration.
The Great Society asked not how much, but how good.
6 months after becoming president, Johnson announced his Great Society program. Speaking at the University of Michigan, Johnson declared that the Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice. The Great Society is a place where every child can find knowledge to enrich his mind and to enlarge his talents. It is a place where man can renew contact with nature. It is a place where men are more concerned with the quality of their goals than with the quantity of their goods. He proposed investments in urban improvements, in education, and in poverty eradication. A year after announcing the Great Society, Johnson declared a war on poverty. The war on poverty aimed at helping the most impoverished segments of American society, most notably African Americans. Great Society liberals thought that the post-war economy was structurally sound and equitable. Unlike the pre-New Deal economy, where more than half of Americans couldn't afford homes, and over 40% of workers made less than a living wage, post-World War II economy saw incomes rise for a large majority of Americans, and homeownership rates surpassed 60%. Furthermore, the economy was not depressed as it was in the 1930s. So Great Society liberals claimed capitalism was creating not only prosperity, but also resolving class conflict. Why then, they asked, did prosperity bypass some people? Liberal social scientists posited that cultural, individual, and family pathologies impaired poor people. Liberal anthropologists called this the culture of poverty, a concept Oscar Lewis created to understand poverty in supposedly underdeveloped countries. The culture of poverty concept assumed that healthy households consisted of a dominant male breadwinner and a submissive female homemaker. The male breadwinner household raised children in a structured and hierarchical environment, teaching them discipline and delayed gratification. It provided mothers with the time and means to focus on raising children to be well-adjusted citizens and workers. Central to the culture of poverty thesis was the supposed problem of the matriarchal household. Female head of households were more common in poor and black families. Social scientists of the 1950s and 1960s said this arrangement emasculated young men. Emasculation, in turn, incited men to lash out violently and impulsively. Without a stay-at-home mom to nurture and comfort them, they lacked the security to put off gratification. Without a present father, they never learned responsibility, and in time would abandon their own children, thus perpetuating the cycle. Social scientists argued that the culture of poverty cycle was rooted in racism and discrimination, but that it eventually became a self-perpetuating pathology. The single-parent matriarchal household, so the argument goes, emerged during slavery, when slavers often broke up families. It continued into the Jim Crow era, where extreme poverty frequently drove black men to leave their families in search of work. But, the argument goes, even as these sources of discrimination disappeared, the culture remained, one of female-led households and black male violence, impulsiveness, promiscuity, and irresponsibility. The most famous promulgation of the culture of poverty thesis came from an assistant secretary in Johnson's Labor Department Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who published a study called The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, which is better known as the Moynihan Report. Lyndon Johnson relied on the Moynihan Report when he crafted his War on Poverty announcement. He claimed that Negro poverty is not white poverty, that there were differences, deep, corrosive, obstinate differences, radiating painful roots into the community and into the family and in the nature of the individual. Perhaps the most important reason for black poverty was the breakdown of the Negro family structure. He explained that the family is the cornerstone of our society. More than any other force, it shapes the attitude, the hopes, the ambitions, and the values of the child. And when the family collapses, it is the children that are usually damaged. So, unless we work to strengthen the family, to create conditions under which most parents will stay together, all the rest, schools and playgrounds, and public assistance and private concern, will never be enough to cut completely the circle of despair and deprivation. Johnson assured that the differences between white and black people were not racial. They were solely and simply the consequences of ancient brutality, past injustice, and present prejudice. The point about present prejudice reflected discourse originating from Gunnar Myrdal's 1944 book, An American Dilemma. In that work, Myrdal argued that white prejudice caused black poverty, which reinforced white prejudice, thereby causing more poverty. What that meant is that whites discriminated against black people on the grounds that black workers were less industrious, less intelligent, and less skilled, and this discrimination prevented black laborers from acquiring skills and jobs, thus confirming white stereotypes. Prejudice, in the eyes of Great Society liberals, rested on these self-fulfilling stereotypes. If you could reverse that culture of poverty, then white prejudice might just fade away. In referencing ancient brutality, Johnson was actually disavowing contemporary racism. Disavow refers to the collective act of remembering to forget, of legitimizing racist institutions by acknowledging past transgressions, but only as past. In the classic example, settlers condemn the crimes their ancestors perpetrated against Native Americans, denounce and redress individual instances of modern racial bigotry, but then affirm settler colonialism by reducing native peoples to assimilated subcultures within our mythical, pluralistic, multicultural democracy, thereby obscuring the reality that native peoples constitute a multitude of conquered nations still fighting for land and resources they are entitled to through hundreds of treaties they negotiated with the United States government. In the culture of poverty discourse, settler memory functions similarly. Settlers lament the great crimes of slavery and Jim Crow, and then either attribute present inequalities to the scars and trauma of those historical crimes or to individual prejudice, all the while refusing to perceive that black poverty is a matter of wealth and land deprivation, not white psychology or black culture. There were proposals for poverty eradication which pivoted less on the pathology of the poor than on providing everyone who worked with sufficient income or a good job. Famous conservative economist Milton Friedman proposed a generous negative income tax. With a negative income tax, the government determines what should be a living wage and makes up the difference through tax refunds. As early as World War II, liberals contemplated creating a national agency which could coordinate with businesses, states, and local governments to guarantee a job for every American who wanted to work. But Southern Democrats, fearful that federal involvement in labor markets could undermine white patriarchy, as well as encourage unionization in the South, teamed up with Republicans to first defund the National Resources Planning Board and then block a 1945 Senate full employment bill. The Johnson administration rejected the negative income tax and never seriously considered a full employment bill. Johnson said he believed in hand-ups, not hand-outs. After all, if poverty resulted from individuals failing to take advantage of abundant opportunity, then the solution had to be providing all individuals with the means to exploit those opportunities, not in simply guaranteeing people jobs or giving people more money for their work. So the Johnson administration supported policies which ostensibly enabled communities to author their own vitalization. The Economic Opportunity Act required community action agencies be developed, conducted, and administered with maximum feasible participation of residents of the area including the poor. Perhaps the most significant war on poverty provisions were community action programs, which allowed communities to devise unique anti-poverty solutions, such as building community-run health centers and establishing training programs for young men. Few of these programs worked as well as Great Society liberals had hoped, and to a great extent those failures derived from their consensus politics, from their refusal to see the interests of rich and poor as competitive and incompatible. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, for example, was supposed to guarantee adequate education for all kids regardless of their socioeconomic status. Under this act, the government distributed funds on the basis of the number of poor children in a district. A 1977 study found that most of the funds for Title I supported programs for the middle class and well-to-do. Local administrators simply used ESEA funds to benefit the more well-off students in their districts. With the Economic Opportunity Act, city governments simply ignored the maximum feasible participation doctrine and designed community action projects without representation from impoverished communities. In the first few years of the program, the Office of Economic Opportunity rejected these plans, but Democratic mayors raged against the program, and the Johnson administration bowed to them. Community action agencies returned to the control of city officials concerned mainly with their well-off white constituencies. The Office of Economic Opportunity created the Jobs Corps to train young men to obtain and hold jobs. The OEO hired some of the largest corporations in the U.S., IBM, RCA, Litton Industries. In its first year, 300,000 men applied for 10,000 slots. Recruits wound up hundreds of miles from home and isolated in remote training facilities. When they returned home, they still found scant opportunities. Graduates earned about the same after the program as they had before, and 28% of them remained unemployed. Even with skills and training, a racist settler colonial geography excluded black people from good jobs. In a settler colony such as the United States, that is a country where migrants violently displace the existing inhabitants and then reinforce that displacement through subsequent waves of migration, entitlement to land and resources is usually racially prioritized. Natives receive not only the lowest priority, but they must be dispossessed and removed so that settlers can transform land into property. Unsettlement historically has stalked black people as well, but it is not the unsettlement that natives faced. Whereas white settlers want to dispossess and eliminate natives, settler capitalists want to divide white and black labor, which they achieve by offering white laborers exclusive racial wages. This includes priority to jobs, limited amounts of land, some financial resources, and some forms of political power. Black people, in turn, persistently endure greater insecurity. In current times, gentrification is forcing black tenants who are never given the opportunity for homeownership out of communities their families lived in for generations. In the mid-20th century, redlining and urban development served as the processes of unsettlement and exploitation. Let's take Detroit as a principal case study, although I refer to other cities as well. In the 1940s, black people accounted for 2/3 of Detroit's population growth. Even as the black population grew by 150,000 people, only 47,000 units were made available for them, out of 545,000 units total. As of 1951, only 1.15% of new homes constructed in metropolitan Detroit were made available to black people. The Federal Housing Administration exacerbated racial segregation through their residential security maps and surveys, which ranked neighborhoods with grades from A to D. Most important in determining a neighborhood's classification was the level of racial, ethnic, and economic homogeneity. Even a tiny African American population would bring a rating of D, or hazardous, by federal appraisers. So most homes came with racial covenants that forbade their sale to black buyers. The woke 1948 Supreme Court decision, Shelley v. Kramer, made racial covenants unenforceable, but realtors still typically refused to show black people homes in white designated neighborhoods because their code of ethics forbade any act that would lower real estate values. White residents also founded 192 neighborhood organizations between 1943 and 1965, variously called civic associations, protective associations, improvement associations, and homeowner associations. These organizations forged close alliances with real estate firms, which supported segregation because it enabled them to reap exorbitant profits on decrepit buildings. On average, black people paid rents 20 to 40% higher than whites did for equivalent apartments. Neighborhood associations also brandished the threat of mob violence to keep out black residents. They threw stones and bricks through the windows of black-owned homes, dumped trash in their yards, and harassed black real estate agents and their clients. Cities also relied on zoning and development to enforce segregation. Urban renewal projects displaced black residents through federally subsidized slum clearance programs in order to fill downtowns with sports and art venues. City and county planning commissions used highways and industrial belts to create physical buffers between poor black neighborhoods and high-income white neighborhoods. Developers built new subdivisions specifically for black or white families, and realtors steered prospective homebuyers into racially designated areas. Suburbs used exclusionary zoning to make it impossible to build low-income, affordable housing. Through these kinds of policies, Charlotte confined 96% of its black populations to this northwest quadrant by the end of the 1960s. Besides overt residential discrimination, economic discrimination trapped black people in disintegrating inner cities. Managers at factories with predominantly white labor forces wouldn't hire black people because they feared disruptions to the workplace. White workers often rioted when presented with the prospect of working with black people. In 1943, for example, 47 cities suffered 242 race riots. Black people were almost entirely excluded from skilled trades such as tool and die makers and electricians because white craftsmen refused to take black apprentices. They were excluded from the building trades for the same reason. While unions on the national level rejected racial discrimination, on the local level unions balked at enrolling black members. This meant that union benefits only protected white workers. Black workers were denied seniority, and white bosses hired black workers last and fired them first. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights found that during the recession of 1973 to 1974, 60 to 70% of laid-off workers were African Americans in areas where they only made up 10 to 12% of the workforce. In factories, they were only hired for the most dangerous, unskilled, and lowest-paying work. So even if black people wanted to move to nicer suburbs, and even if banks and real estate agents didn't discriminate against them, low wages, insecure work, and higher rent denied black workers the means to save up for a down payment. And that is very significant because in the post-war era, good-paying jobs moved from cities to suburbs. Between 1948 and 1967, Detroit lost nearly 130,000 manufacturing jobs. In the 50s, Atlanta accounted for 90% of the office space in Fulton County. By the 90s, only 13%. In 1966, black people held only 2% of the white-collar jobs in the South. Training black people was meaningless without giving them the means to move to places where there were jobs. In fairness, liberals understood that segregation exacerbated racial inequality, although they misunderstood why segregation was so detrimental. To them, it was not so much that white settler society deprived black communities of vital economic resources, as it was that segregation deprived black people of white culture. The Brown versus Board of Education decision, for instance, is celebrated for ending legal segregation in public schools. At its core, however, was the belief that a black community could not by itself be healthy or normal, and that segregation from the white community retarded the development of black people. As the ruling stated, segregation of white and colored in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. After black riots broke out in 1967 throughout numerous cities, including Newark and Detroit, the Johnson administration tapped Illinois Governor Otto Kerner to lead a National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, which is better known as the Kerner Commission. They studied the cause of urban unrest and concluded that America was moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. The Kerner Commission advocated higher taxes to pay for anti-poverty programs and residential integration as formal public policy. The Department of Housing and Urban Development contemplated withholding federal highway funds and infrastructure subsidies from suburban jurisdictions which employed exclusionary zoning, but Richard Nixon demanded this initiative, called Open Communities, be shut down. Conservatives in both the Democratic and Republican parties attacked integrationist policies as violations of individual freedom and consumer rights. While they opposed laws which explicitly discriminated on the basis of race, they argued that nothing should be done to stop class segregation produced by supposedly natural market forces. In other words, they claimed suburbs were white because of consumer choice and meritocratic individualism, not structural racism.
Tonight on 48 Hours.
We're not racist.
The judge's order, desegregate now or else.
No! I don't think the people in this city are going to stand for it.
The homeowner's answer, no way.
The hardworking, we are the bill-paying, we are the tax-paying, and yes, we are the law-abiding backbone of American society.
At Charlotte in 1968, Richard Nixon proclaimed he stood for forgotten Americans, people who go to work, attend church, and pay their taxes. White professionals created organizations such as the Concerned Parents Association, which opposed integration through busing. In 1970, the CPA organized massive rallies, and white parents appropriated verses from the civil rights anthem, "We Shall Overcome." More effective than overt resistance, privatization enabled well-off white families to sustain racial inequality. In 1954, only 123 Christian schools existed in America, enrolling about 12,000 students. By 1981, there were 18,000 Christian schools with 2 million students. In 1985, whites made up only 6% of the public school population in Atlanta. Whites in Georgia rejected an extension of the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit for fear that it would facilitate desegregation, and by a more than 2-to-1 margin starting in the 1960s began to rely on cars more than buses. If you want to know why traffic is so crappy in this country, blame racism. Businessmen opposed federal funding for public housing, claiming that it posed a threat to the sanctity of private enterprise. Landlords became especially adept at lambasting public housing as warrens of welfare cheats and government waste. Organized commercial opposition stifled public housing in the United States. By 1980, public housing only accounted for 1% of the U.S. housing market, compared to 46% in Great Britain and 37% in France. Commercial interests, however, did not oppose enormous funds the federal government sent local governments for urban redevelopment. By 1955, southern states relied on federal grants for 20% of their revenues. Timing also favored conservative messaging. The Johnson administration's focus on black poverty at a time when rising inflation eroded wages alienated white workers. The bad timing was, to a great extent, Johnson's own making. Fearing that Republicans could paint him as soft on communism if Vietnam fell to the National Liberation Front, Johnson escalated the war in Vietnam, which drove inflation. Inflation quadrupled between 1964 and 1969. Nixon linked the welfare policies of Democrats to higher taxes and higher inflation, and claimed it was workers who paid the price.
And who's going to pay for this? Well, if you're not the one out of 2 people on welfare, you do.
This strategy worked. In 1960, 60% of low-income workers voted for the Democratic ticket. In 1972, only 35% did. Nixon shockingly won a majority of the Union vote in 1972. Just as white militias spearheaded the genocide of Native Americans pre-20th century, racist white laborers and the so-called professional middle class operated as citizen deputies of white settler capitalism. This had terrible consequences. It prevented unions from incorporating non-white laborers, as well as from spreading into regions of the country outside of the Northeast and Midwest. States in the so-called Sun Belt region could advertise themselves as business-friendly, drawing jobs and factories from the Rust Belt region, accelerating a neoliberal race to the bottom for labor. Landlords could charge black tenants more, and employers could pay them less. It's important to understand that the high-income professionals who organized to oppose integration and the low-income blue-collar workers who switched from Democratic to Republican parties didn't talk explicitly in racial terms. Out loud, they claimed it was about freedom, the freedom to choose your own neighbor, the freedom to live in neighborhoods which excluded people on the basis of class rather than race. As to why black people were disproportionately poor, they blamed federal government spending for creating dependency, even though racial inequalities long predated Great Society programs. The lie about dependency began to dominate political norms by the 1980s. A particularly influential book was Charles Murray's Losing Ground, which argued that the war on poverty worsened poverty. Food stamps, Medicaid, and welfare allegedly encouraged women to bear children outside of marriage, which created a culture of dependency on the federal government. The solution to poverty then was to slash the welfare state and to force poor mothers to depend upon themselves. This book was based on bad statistics and on outright fabrications. The poverty rate since the 1960s had actually declined considerably. The data also showed that the vast majority of welfare recipients worked and only relied on welfare temporarily and sporadically. But the facts didn't matter. What mattered was the narrative of irresponsibility, immorality, and deviation from the white middle-class family norm. This book became a kind of Bible among conservatives, unlike the actual one they usually ignore. But its assumption about cultures of poverty constituted an important continuity between Great Society liberalism and 1980s conservatism. Both said it was the culture of the poor that needed to be reformed. Both inadequately addressed issues of structural racism, systemic unemployment, and deindustrialization. The Reagan administration made it easier for states to kick welfare recipients off their rolls. He cut food stamps budget by 13%, rendering 1 million people ineligible, eliminated 300,000 jobs financed through a federal jobs program, and expelled 590,000 students from the school lunch program. To save costs on school lunches, the Reagan administration allowed schools to classify condiments, such as ketchup, as vegetables. The culture of poverty narrative culminated in Bill Clinton's welfare reforms of 1996, which limited lifetime welfare benefits to 5 years and placed work requirements on receiving welfare. Welfare recipients had to meet with caseworkers every week, which supposedly would help them serve as better role models for their children, thereby breaking the cycle of poverty. The reforms failed. The percentage of children who grew up in families that received welfare who themselves went on to receive welfare increased. There was a temporary increase in the percentage of working welfare recipients, but that fell as the economy stagnated. The number of children living in extreme poverty, defined as $2 a day per person in the household, doubled in 15 years. Despite its intentions, the war on poverty neither eradicated poverty nor racial inequality. Today, the average white family possesses 10 times as much wealth as the average black family. The black homeownership rate is 43%, compared to over 71% for white families. At all education levels, black unemployment is nearly twice as high as white unemployment. About 19% of black households suffer from food insecurity, compared to less than 8% of white households. I highlight these statistics not to diminish the economic hardships that working-class white people face, but to illuminate the structural inequalities that keep the engine of settler capitalism running. As Karl Marx wrote, labor in the white skin can never free itself as long as labor in the black skin is branded. But thank you for watching this video. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe.